Welcome to the Jersey Justice Podcast, featuring your hosts, attorneys Gerald Clark and Mark Morris.
All right, Dean Riccio, thank you for coming in. So what is it with Italians and not aging? You look amazing.
Thank you.
I'm assuming you're Italian by the name.
You assume correctly, 100%.
Yeah,
mother and father.
You look amazing.
Thank you.
So you're super well known in the New Jersey legal field. You've probably over the course of your career touched, the lives of people that became judges, justices, Supreme Court justices, and everything. Tell us about how you got started, where you grew up, how you got into this.
Sure. Well, I'll begin at the beginning. I was born and raised in Jersey City. I had two terrific parents. I met my wife in Jersey City. I was 8 years old and she was 6. We lived a couple of houses away from each other, and we've been together, married for 55 years, and I've known her for over 70 years. So very fond memories of Jersey City. Growing up, academics wasn't a high priority for me, nor for my friends. We were more interested in other things, sports, being independent, not too many mischievous things, but a few.
We'd all be lying if we said we never did anything
That's
mischievous
right.
when we were young.
That's right. But nothing illegal that I'm aware of anyway.
Yeah.
I was fortunate in the sense that I was a pretty good baseball player. That was my ticket to get to college. I received a scholarship to Seton Hall University. I played baseball there for 4 years. Toyed with the idea of trying professionally, but made a wise decision not to. But what happened to me in college is that I ran into a couple of teachers who had a positive influence on me, made me realize that I did have a level of intelligence that was worth unlocking. I became a serious student for the first time in my life, because it didn't happen in grammar school and high school, and decided to pursue the law, which I did, not knowing a thing about it. Nowadays, the kids that think about going to law school, they study everything. I studied nothing. I don't think I had even seen a lawyer before I started law school. But once I began studying law, probably like yourself, you fall in love with it, or some people do, and I certainly did. The old expression, which is no longer politically correct, the law is a jealous mistress. More accurately, the law is a jealous significant other, is the way I put it. And that's what it was for me. And I ran into some wonderful people in the law, some lifelong friends that I've made. And I became a serious student and began my career after law school serving a clerkship in federal court, which at that time were hard to get, still are. And I had a terrific judge that I worked with, Judge Whipple. Then I joined what became my law firm, along with 4 others. That firm grew to about 40 people. And it was in 1988 that I decided to pursue something else. I was approached about the idea of either becoming a judge, a federal judge, or becoming the dean of the law school. And I opted for the dean of the law school, and it was the best choice I ever made.
I got a couple questions going
Sure.
back. So you grew up in Jersey City.
Mm-hmm.
Were your parents immigrants, or how did that? What's your?
My parents, my grandparents were immigrants from Italy.
All right.
My mother and father had no formal education to speak of. But my father, I don't think he made it out of high school. I'm not quite sure about my mother. My brother was a spectacular student. He went to Xavier High School in New York City, which back then was an elite military school. some of the alums, Justice Scalia, for example, was an alum of Xavier High School. So he was really the intellect in the family. And I was so proud of him. He was just a spectacular person. My parents were so proud of him. But I was more not in the same category of him as a student. I didn't really apply myself. And as I said, I was a decent baseball player, was able to get a Division I scholarship, and that was my focus. Thinking back then, I'm going to be a major leaguer, like a lot of these high school kids think.
Yeah.
And by the time I got to college, I realized that was not in the cards.
Yeah.
But so yeah, that's the way it happened for me. A late bloomer, I suppose some people might say, as far as intellectual capabilities were concerned. My friends from Jersey City didn't care about school, but they were wonderful, and I loved them dearly. And I learned a lot about life, hanging out in the schoolyard on Iggy Avenue in Jersey City. It was a real melting pot.
Yeah.
And you got to understand how to interact with people, all different kinds.
Was it sort of like an Italian neighborhood or whatever, or how did that work?
It was mixed. Yeah. It was mixed. It was probably predominantly Irish.
Yeah.
Then there were Italians, Poles, African American, Latinos, Jewish. I mean, a lot of the ethnic groups that populate this country came to Jersey City because that's where Ellis Island is a stone's throw away from Jersey City. So when they got off the boat, they didn't have too far to go, and many of them settled in Jersey City. So their offspring, people like myself, we were thrown into that, and you got exposed to so many different cultures and so many different ways of looking at things, and so many different religions and values and ethics.
Yeah.
And I could tell you that was, of all of the education I've had in my life, the best education was right there in Jersey City from age 5 to age 20.
Yeah. You learn how to read people and street smarts and stuff.
Yeah. When I became dean of the law school, it was so easy for me to interact with all of the different personalities. And there were plenty of them that you had to interact with, both on the faculty, the administration, the staff, and the students. I could relate to all of them, and they could relate to me.
I remember, my grandparents came from Ireland on the one side and Italy on the other side. I remember I went to Ireland, and I was in Dublin, and they have the famine mural, which is like there's a family, maybe a husband and a wife, and they're really skinny, and then one's carrying their dead son that died of starvation on the way, from the potato famine. And do you? I feel like sometimes with immigrants that often you get the best. The people that were able to survive, the people that were, had the ingenuity to persevere and get through. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, we had Judge D'Amico on here recently, and he talked about how his father came from Sicily and was running from a border guard trying to get into France or something, and threw his suitcase and tripped the border guard, and he was able to get over the border. And how do you relate that to today with all the stuff going on with immigration and I think in many ways, immigrants can be viewed as like scapegoats and they're taking our jobs and problems, or is it something else where it maybe grows the pot?
I think the common denominator with most immigrants, I mean, you can't say all because you don't know, but with most immigrants, the common denominator is to get a better life.
Yeah.
They come to the United States, to America, to get a better life, to get opportunity, and to pursue that opportunity with freedom and liberty. I look, for example, if my grandparents were still with me today and looking at what my life has been, they would feel great.
Yeah.
They couldn't do it, right, because they had too many obstacles to overcome. But they came here.
Yeah.
And by coming here, they provided opportunity for their children, and in my case, their grandchildren. my mother's mother, she was put on a boat when she was 14 years old because her family in Italy couldn't support her. Yeah. They didn't have enough. So if you can think about a 14-year-old girl being put on a boat, shipped to the United States to meet someone she never met before, who was probably a distant relative.
Yeah.
The kind of life that she must have had. And I can remember that she wouldn't talk a whole lot about it because I can only imagine what her life must have been like. Yeah. But when I think about the sacrifices that she made, and my parents for that matter. I mean, my mother and father started out with nothing, and we were not poor. Yeah. But we were less than middle class. Let's put it that way. And what they did to provide opportunities for me, and the valuable lessons that I learned from the family get-togethers and things like that. You can't quantify it. Yeah. Because it's part of what made me who I am and what I've done or didn't do in my life.
It's interesting too when you think about the unfairness in the world and different societies in terms of the sort of the untapped intelligence that's swirling around the gene pool. You went to law school, you did well. It's certainly, I'm sure a lot of it's hard work, but probably a lot of it is also genetics. You're just genetically smart. So you think about the unfairness when you talk about, your great-grandmother and everything. They probably had a certain level of genetic smarts, but they weren't able to tap into it, at least until a couple generations. But I guess that's what's great about America.
That is so true, Jerry. I know I had one of my aunts, my father's sister, she would write beautiful poetry, totally uneducated. I also think about the life of African Americans. I mean, wasn't until the mid-50s that African Americans were allowed to play in the NBA, for example. Look at the difference today. Yeah. Or, of course, the Jackie Robinson story and things like that. So it's not just immigrant, from Europe or other countries. It's also the residual effect of slavery and Jim Crow that affected minorities, African Americans and others, women, in a similar way to the immigrants coming over and having to start from scratch.
Do you think, when you talk about Jim Crow and we talk about, the Civil Rights Act and things, affirmative action, and I'm not asking you to take any political positions on stuff, but just kind of some thoughts come to mind is that, do you think and you must have seen this, you're the dean of Seton Hall Law School for 11 or 12 years, where, certainly there was a time for affirmative action. Certainly there was racism and oppression in the country, and certainly there still is. But does it sometimes get to the point where the pendulum swings the other way a bit much? And, like we've elected our first black president, African-American vice president, where sort of the oppressed can maybe in some ways become the oppressors, where, well, now we're in power. And I don't want to go too off on a tangent here, but some people equate being against the secular government of Israel and perhaps, policies of Israel as somehow anti-Semitic. And not that we're going to go down that road, but can when we talk about, when you see historically, you grew up in a very different era, but does the pendulum sometimes swing hard the other way, where now it's getting a little crazy?
Yeah. Well, every good idea can have some negative collateral consequences. Yeah. The entire debate of affirmative action, when I was teaching it in constitutional law, I would put up on the board. I never used any technology because if I did, it wouldn't have worked. But I used to put a list up on the board for the students. Arguments for, arguments against, and we would go through them. And certainly now it appears that the Supreme Court is almost 100%, at least a majority of the court, opposed to any type of affirmative action, unless the affirmative action is designed to remedy specific instances of
Yeah.
racial discrimination. If you don't have that, then to just have it for the sake of having it's not going to be consistent with the 14th Amendment. But I will say this. When I used to teach con law, if I had a class that did not have any minority students in it versus a class that did, sometimes it was both, the conversation in the classroom and the learning experience was different.
Yeah.
It was better when you had minority students in the class because they had a viewpoint
Yes.
that even I, as the teacher, as much as I would try to express that,
Yeah.
it's different. So how you accomplish that is another question altogether, whether you do it through affirmative action or just through merit, and this is the end result. That's a separate question. But is it a better educational experience to have a diverse student body than a non-diverse student body? In my opinion, 100%.
You know, I remember, and Mark, please jump in, I know, but I remember when I was a young lawyer, some say like when I was a puppy lawyer, I had these blinders on, and, you know, whoever I was representing or whatever my worldview was, you know, how could you, of course that's how it is. How could you think anything different? And I learned as I got older and reading books about the power in putting yourself in your adversary's shoes or putting yourself in the shoes of a juror or putting yourself in someone else's shoes, because even today when we look at all the craziness in the world and the craziness in the country, if you look at it from my own worldview, it can be very stressful and very difficult. But I think if you look, I've learned that about looking at it from others' perspectives. And you must have seen that, again, managing an entire law school. You're probably at conference room tables with difference of opinion. And do you see a value in that and kind of putting yourself in the shoes of, not to have a moral relativism or where anything goes, but at least to momentarily put yourself there and see it from the other's perspective?
Well, yes. I mean, that is certainly true. One of the examples I used to use when we would cover race relations and the history of Jim Crow, for example, or slavery, going back to the beginning, which is what I used to do. A lot of the students, non-minority students, Caucasian students, they would make the argument that, well, I didn't oppress anybody. It wasn't my fault.
Yeah.
This happened a long time ago. And in order to make the point, I would oftentimes give the example of my grandparents who came to this country, were not even citizens, right? They were still going through the process.
Yeah.
And if they got on a bus...
Thank God there was no ice back then, but anyway.
Yeah. When they would get on a bus in, let's say, Birmingham, Alabama, they could sit wherever they want on the bus. They weren't even citizens. They contributed nothing to the country.
Yeah.
But if you were an African-American person at that time, whose family had been here for generations, who made valuable contributions to the country, they couldn't do what my grandparents could do. And I would just pose the question, is that right? And it would precipitate a discussion. You try to put yourself in the shoes of others, is what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And that was one way of doing it. And it would generally produce a pretty good dialogue. And I think the students liked it. I mean, one of the things that I'm very proud of is that when I started as dean, in fact, when I interviewed for the position, I had to get interviewed by every faculty member.
Is that a little weird though? Because the faculty is like, ooh, I better not interview him too hard because he might be my boss soon.
Or they're jealous. Maybe they were thinking they were up for dean.
There was some of that, but there was no reticence in expressing their views. I remember one senior faculty member, and it stuck in my mind. He said, quote, "You have no business wanting to be dean of this law school."
Really? Wow.
Yeah. But he was proven wrong, I'm happy to say.
Yeah.
But only through effort and performance that I engaged in. But one of the questions that was asked of me was, well, you have no teaching experience. How do you expect to be a teacher?
Yeah.
And I said, well, I do have teaching experience. And they said, well, what is that? And I said, I taught third grade CCD, which I did, and it produced a laugh. But it was not lost on me that I needed to do what they do.
Yeah.
As good or better.
So wait. So when you're interviewing for the dean, and did you see it coming that he was going to be so against you like that, or?
Well, yeah, because I came from the private practice.
Yeah.
I wasn't a scholar. I hadn't
Yeah.
written law review articles
Yeah.
and things like that. I wrote one as a law student, but nothing like what they were looking for. I was a Seton Hall alum. I didn't come from an Ivy League school.
Yeah.
So in their eyes, well, Ron's a pretty good lawyer. He's in his early 40s. He started his own law firm with some others. But, what is that? How does that qualify him to be dean?
Yeah, it sounds like you faced a little bit of intellectual elitism there.
Yeah.
But my guess is when he came at you like that at that interview, that you weren't ruffled at all.
Not
my
at
guess,
all.
Okay, because I'm thinking
16
you
years.
probably got your ass kicked in the school ground back in Jersey City once in a while, and you had plenty of people in your face back in the day.
Nothing motivates me more than somebody saying, "You're not good enough. You can't do this." That's all I need to hear.
Yeah.
I remember one time I had a case, and we lost the motion in federal district court, and the lawyer who was working with me on that case said to me, "Well, the case is over. We lost." From that moment on, he was out of the case.
Yeah.
I did it myself.
Yeah.
It was a class action. We received a $150 million settlement. When it came time for our fee application, I had to document how many briefs I had written.
Yeah.
58 briefs. What drove me in that case, in addition to trying to help the victims of franchise discrimination, what drove me was that my lawyer from the law firm telling me, "We lost, the case is over."
Yeah.
I can't stand that. I'm going to fight until I can't fight anymore. If I lose, I lose. In the sports betting case, which
Yeah.
I don't know whether you.
I looked into that. That's awesome. Legalized sports betting at Monmouth Park Racetrack.
Yeah, I mean,
2018.
in 2018, I represented Monmouth Park in a lawsuit to overturn the Federal Professional and Amateur Sports Protection Act, PASPA. And Dennis Drazen was the client, so to speak, but Dennis was also a champion, really, of sports betting and helping to bring it to Monmouth Park. But when Dennis called me about the case and told me how the federal statute worked, I said, "Dennis, I think that's a 10th Amendment violation because the statute didn't criminalize sports betting. It directed the states not to legalize sports betting." Different approach. In any event, we fought that case for about 7 or 8 years, up and down in the federal district court, the Third Circuit, 2 or 3 times. We lost every time, every single time. Finally, they called it a Hail Mary. We petitioned for cert for the second time in the Supreme Court. They took the case, and it was as Alito's opinion said that the other side misread our precedents. Could you imagine? We had to litigate a case for 7 years, and the Supreme Court is now telling all of these other smart lawyers on the other side, "You misread our precedents." And it wasn't complicated. And we won the case.
Wow. Did you have to actually argue the case in front of the Supreme Court?
The case was argued by Ted Olson.
Okay.
Because when you are co-petitioners, only one lawyer can speak. And Ted Olson, you may remember, he recently passed, was one of the most accomplished Supreme Court practitioners in the country. I unfortunately took a back seat during the oral argument. But we submitted our briefs, and we were we were co-petitioners in every way. And especially going up through the courts, I argued every case. Yeah.
Wow.
So wait, let me step back. And that's with your current law firm, McElroy, Deutsch, Mulvaney, and Carpenter?
Right.
After your career as dean.
Yes. What happened?
Were you still teaching at the time as well?
let's see. I stopped teaching in 2016. Yeah, so yes, probably
Wow.
yes, and not probably. I was still teaching con law.
So you're representing what? The New Jersey
The
Thoroughbreds
Thoroughbred, yeah.
Association?
We represented the New Jersey Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association, who were the operators of Monmouth Park racetrack under a lease with the New Jersey Sports and Exposition Authority.
Right.
And they were the ones that initiated this. If you wanted to know the beginning of how sports betting became legal in this country, it traces back to that.
Okay, but as far as I can remember, you could always bet at Monmouth Park. So what were they trying to do? Like expand it or something? Like I don't know. And how did that benefit the client? Why was the client trying to do that if they already had Monmouth Park and you're already able to bet there?
So Monmouth Park was betting on horse races,
Yeah,
not betting on sports contests.
got it.
So if you wanted to bet on,
Oh, so you'd go to Monmouth Park
Yeah.
to bring more people there and bet on a baseball game or something.
the idea was that horse racing, Monmouth Park needed additional revenue
Yeah,
to continue to operate as a racetrack for horses,
right.
which is a major industry in the state. In order to supplement the revenue from horse racing, which was not sufficient to keep Monmouth Park alive as an economically sustainable thoroughbred racetrack,
Yeah,
you needed to look for alternative sources of revenue,
got it.
one of which was sports betting, which was illegal, but everybody knew that if you wanted to bet
Yeah,
on a
Yeah.
you call some
Sporting
bookie
con-
that's
yeah.
that's
so
set
so
up.
the idea was this is not the way it should be. It
Right.
should be legalized and regulated, heavily regulated.
So it was illegal under New Jersey state law?
It was illegal under federal and state law
Okay,
throughout the country.
got it.
There were a couple of minor exceptions, but what we ended up doing is we invalidated the federal statute, which then left it up to the states to decide whether or not they wanted to authorize sports betting, which most of the states have done.
Has that kind of ushered in the era that we have now, where so many states are allowing for online betting and things like that?
Totally.
Wow.
The decision, the case that Dennis and I pursued from the beginning, that case is the case that resulted in the proliferation of sports betting throughout the country.
I have a lot of friends that would like to shake your hand,
Well,
or say, "Hey, you owe me
smack me in the head.
Yeah. So wait, all right. So I have some questions about this. Okay. So this case out of New Jersey is what invalidated the federal statute?
Yeah,
That's amazing.
Wow,
and
that is-
the co-petitioner, Ted Olson, who did they represent? Where
state of New Jersey, the governor.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
What happened is the horseman, my client,
Yeah.
we decided early on that something needed to be done to save Monmouth Park Racetrack as a going concern, because it's whether you like horse racing or not, Monmouth Park is a fixture
It is.
in
And,
Monmouth
big
County.
time.
and also it helps the open space, I think, in the state as well.
There's economic studies which put a dollar value on the horse racing industry, the
Yeah.
thoroughbred horse racing industry. So it made nothing but sense to try to invalidate this federal statute, which, as you know, it's hard to do.
Yeah.
There's a presumption of
gosh.
validity that you have to overcome. But it was pretty clear to me that under the 10th Amendment, the federal government can't tell the states what laws to make and not make.
So you came up with that sort of analysis and thinking
Yeah.
that through.
Well, I was teaching con law.
was gonna
To
say,
me, it was.
that's-
It
yeah.
wasn't. I'd like to tell you that it was a brilliant idea, but it was pretty cut and dry in my eyes. There were 2 United States Supreme Court cases that were right on point, and I told Dennis, I said, Dennis, this looks like a pretty strong case.
I think we're both now excited about this, but how
I know.
much translates between being a professor, being a lawyer? How much does being a lawyer help with being a professor, and being a professor help with being a lawyer, especially with something you're talking about now, a constitutional issue like that?
I mean, for me, teaching was all about blending my experience as a practicing lawyer and the academic side of it. It was using every course I taught, I was able many times to give examples of cases I had that would make the legal point that you were trying to get across to the students, right?
I remember we did a class action with Alan Cantor years ago. It was called Cooper Tire, the Cooper Tire case. And Alan was teaching at Tulane Law School. And one of the assignments he gave his law school class was to write up and address a preemption issue, which Cooper Tire happened to be using in the case. They had this big preemption defense. And I remember they went to the judge and they said, he's having his law students come up and write the briefs and come up with these legal arguments and everything. And it was just the funniest thing because, but he had like a little sort of petri dish there of, I mean, you know how it is. Like when we're working at law firms, we barely have time to go get a drink of water or eat lunch, much less, super dive in and read cases and intellectually think about things, which, by the way, I think is one of the things our country's lacking now is just time to just think unconnected. But the things that you can come up with and the nuts that you can crack just by thinking, just walking in the woods and thinking. But did you find that teaching con law and having these intellectual discussions gave you the luxury of this kind of time to think up that kind of thing like that?
What you just said, you literally took the words right out of my mouth.
I get criticized for that on the podcast for talking too much. Go ahead.
No. The point that you're making about thinking, I've been preaching that for decades. Even before I became the dean of the law school, when I had my own law firm, sometimes I would be sitting in my office looking out the window.
Yeah.
And, some of the wise colleagues would say, "Oh, boy, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Who are you billing this to?" Or some silly comment like that. And I said, "I'm doing what you should be doing." And they go, "What's that?" "I'm thinking."
Yeah.
But see, the thinking, lawyers don't just think when they're working. When I'm in a case, it's probably true, I can't get it out of my mind.
100%. Yeah.
Right? And it's so bad now that if I'm in the middle of working on something, I'm often up at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning.
It's so I'm in the shower this morning getting ready to come here, and we're starting a trial on June 1st, and I'm here soaping my head in the shower thinking through an evidence issue and how is the defense going to try to get this out, and how, like, I'm trying to think 5 steps ahead. And then as I walk in, Jake, who's an awesome lawyer here, I pop in and I'm talking to him about this issue. He's here on a Sunday morning working, which tells you a lot. And and it really helps,
It's, I mean, there's not enough of that goes on. A lot of times, lawyers just like to press a button and get an answer. But part of being a good lawyer is being a creative thinker.
Big time.
There's a lot of elements to it. You got to be a creative thinker, an effective writer, a clear communicator. I mean, a compassionate person, sensitive. There's so many qualities. I used to say it's the quality of the mind and the heart. That's what you bring to your practice.
There are so many different layers to it. You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And that concept too, the deep work, that's such a big deal, especially in this era of like instant, give me information.
Every case I've ever had, it's been that way, and as I've gotten older, it's a blessing and a curse, and because as I said, if my eyes open up at 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning and the wheels start turning, I can't go back to sleep, and I have to get up and do whatever it is I happen to be doing at that time.
The other problem too is it's like I find it's hard to shut it off sometimes, and it's even harder today because the line between working and not working is so blurred because of the cell phones and the instant. And I used to commute more. Like I used to have like maybe an hour commute. I always had at least a half-hour commute, and it would give me time to decompress and everything. And God bless my wife and my family because I'll be in the room working, and when we're working, it's like. Wait, was it 3 or 3.1? Or is it 3.2? Which is it? You said 3. You said about 4. Is it 3.1 or 3.2? And then I'll be doing that like my job, and then 30 seconds later I'll walk into the kitchen and my wife's like, I'll be like, what? No, is it 3.1 or 3? And I'll do the same thing, and God bless my family and my wife for having to deal with that
They
because
understand it.
you know, sometimes it's hard to shut it off, but we're constantly thinking
Yeah.
and constantly doing, you know.
But that's part of the enjoyment of it, I think.
Yeah.
That's why I'm still doing it. You know, I'm not a spring chicken anymore, but I'm still as enthusiastic about matters that I'm working on as I've always been. When that ends, then I'll stop doing it.
Yeah.
Did you have like over the years like a healthy? Is it good as a lawyer in your view to have like a healthy level of paranoia, like kind of watching the front and watching your back and your flank and
Not paranoia in dealing with people, but paranoia in the sense, I wouldn't even call it paranoia. I would call it being obsessed about making sure that every single aspect of what I'm working on has been thoroughly examined. So my view, when dealing with other lawyers, one of the things back in the early 90s, I helped start the New Jersey Commission on Professionalism, which wasn't just about the rules of professional conduct. It's also about civility.
yeah.
And I'm a big believer of that. So I would, every time I interact with another lawyer, whether they're adversaries or co-counsel, I always try to keep things at a very high-class level.
Yeah.
It's not easy sometimes, you know, but I try to do that, and I try to instill that in people that I work with, and certainly did with students. It's not paranoia. It would be, to me, more in the nature of conscientious attention to detail.
Vigilance.
Yeah, and one of the things that bothers me is if there's a letter that goes out or anything that's in writing and there's a typo or something.
Yeah.
I mean, one of my mentors, now deceased, a fellow named Don Robinson, great lawyer. I learned so much from him. And we used to have a challenge. And the challenge was that if I found something in something that he sent out that had a mistake in it, he would owe me $5. And conversely, there was never anything that I sent out that he would find a mistake, because I would go absolutely crazy before I showed it to him. Now, he sometimes would slip up and make a mistake. Of course, he never paid me the $5.
It's giving lawyers a bad reputation.
Yeah, but the point that he was making was the point that I'm making now, is that attention to detail. There is no substitute for attention to detail, careful preparation, thorough research. Think as much as you possibly can about what the issues are. Try to be creative. Come up with ideas. I mean, one of the cases that, Mark, you mentioned to me about the Newark schoolyard murder case.
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you want me to tell you a little bit about that?
Yeah, I definitely want to talk about that.
Bring them back to that. But I have some questions about the horse case first.
Can I
sure.
do one other thing before we go back to the horse? Because it's along the lines of what you just talked about. They called you the wrist back.
Oh, God. Where'd you get
then.
that one from?
Come on, I do my homework with this stuff. They called you the wrist because of your writing style, how organized it was. What was the? It sounds boring, but it matters to me. What was the structure? What was it that you were doing with your legal writing?
So when I was clerking for Judge Whipple, back in those days, the judges would give you, the motions would come in, and you would do a bench memo for the judge. And back in those days, you would write it out, which is, we weren't typing things like you do today. So I used to crank out the memos in record time, because that's just the way I was. I wanted to get the work done. And there was a court clerk back then whose name was Tom Cooney. He was a legendary court clerk for Judge Coulihan. And Tom used to sit in front of the judge's bench during oral argument. And Judge Coulihan, wonderful guy, he rested in peace, and Tom too, sometimes he didn't hear. The lawyer would make the argument, and Tom would let the judge know either sustained or overruled. And so Tom was kind of like, he was a legend. So Tom put that name, he called me the wrist, because I would be writing things so quickly. But my writing style, I don't write anything until I outline it. Okay? You have to organize your thoughts in the sequence in which you want to make them. In fact, this morning, before I came here, getting ready for an oral argument on Tuesday, I wrote out the sequence of the oral argument, and I'll play around with that. Once you have your outline of what it is you want to say and your subpoints, then you can start writing. Once you write it, that's the easy part.
Yeah, you're filling in.
100%
You're filling in,
agree.
and then you got to edit until you get it perfect.
We have an attorney here, very smart. He's a great writer and all that stuff. But I try and hammer that home all the time. I'll be like, you have to outline. I think back to law school, we had IRAC. You identify the issue, the rules, the analysis, and then the conclusion.
Right.
I feel like I do that in every brief I'm trying to do.
Well, my law students used to tease me because I would call it the Legal Analytical Framework, LAF. And if you get a hold of, I would think, pick one of my former students randomly and ask them what the LAF is, they'll remember it. And I use it to this day. I think it's a necessary part of what it is that we do. So that's probably where the wrist, I hadn't heard that in a long time, but brings back a lot of memories, good memories too, by the way.
So what are you arguing on Tuesday? What do you got coming up?
Tuesday is a case pending in Atlantic County in which the county prosecutor is suing the county executive.
Okay.
I don't want to go into any more
Yeah,
details.
that's fine.
Yeah. It's a hot issue in Atlantic County.
All right. But you're appearing in court and arguing on your feet.
I'm probably going to have somebody else argue it.
Okay. Will you go and
probably will go.
Yeah. And so I do want to get back. All right, let's get back to the Horsemen. Do you mind? Can we go?
Sports betting.
Yeah, the sports betting. So Monmouth Park is facing, I guess, financial issues because the horse racing alone isn't going to carry the day. So they're trying to expand to the sports betting and be a hub for sports betting. So had your firm represented them before and they came to you and said, solve this problem, or only obviously stuff that's in the public, but.
Yeah. No, I don't think I represented the Horsemen before. I knew Dennis Drazen was the lawyer for the New Jersey Thoroughbred Horsemen's Association.
Okay.
And I knew Dennis. In fact, we were adversaries in a case. And Dennis called me and asked me what I thought about this issue.
Yeah.
And I spent some time thinking about it.
But they had come up with the idea that maybe we can overturn the ban on sports betting.
Dennis was looking for ways to raise additional revenue to keep the racetrack afloat. In fact, he's still doing that.
Yeah.
There may be, on the ballot this November, there may actually be an item to have a referendum on casino gambling and extending it to Monmouth Park and the Meadowlands. Whether or not that passes, whether or not it makes it on the ballot, whether it passes, another question. But no, horse racing, the entire industry is struggling. And Monmouth Park is struggling, but really thanks to the efforts primarily of Dennis, it has kept the track going. And in order to keep it going, you need to supplement the revenue, which is provided by bettors on races, but isn't enough. And, you don't want to see Monmouth Park close because then that whole industry in New Jersey is going to collapse.
And the open space, because you need places for the horses
the farms and all of that
to graze.
Yeah, they would become, they get developed.
Yeah, nothing kills me more than driving around and seeing these old farms and the McMansions put on them and stuff.
Well, that's part of what we're talking about. And, sports betting has helped. It's raised additional revenue, but you still need more.
It's funny. I'm a big Green Bay Packers fan, and I promise somehow this relates. But they're obviously the smallest market team in the NFL, and there's always articles about how can they generate revenue from their stadium. So they do these stadium tours. They host weddings there. They cater events and all that because it's a constant.
You can buy stock in the
You can
team,
buy stock.
right?
I have a
Fake stock in the
worthless
team.
piece of paper on my wall in the office that
Yeah.
a couple $100, but it's the same struggle where they're like, how do we continue to generate revenue outside of the main thing that we host?
Keeping Monmouth Park afloat is a tough assignment, and Dennis and others deserve a lot of credit for keeping it going. But the sports betting case was one vehicle that generates, I don't know the exact number, but a lot of millions of dollars to keep the track going.
So you're back and forth, you're up and down in federal courts, up to the Supreme Court a couple times. I mean, obviously not talking any numbers or anything, but that must have been a big investment, a big bill to the Horsemen's Association. Was there a point, if you can say, you had said, the one colleague said, we can't win this, but where they're just, was there a sense maybe we're throwing good money at a bad thing here? Like, that's a big investment and a big risk.
It was a big risk, and I give all the credit to Dennis for being a loyal client, because a lot of other clients would have abandoned their lawyer. And I know that there were people saying, well, why don't you get some other lawyer? Riccio keeps losing.
Yeah.
But Dennis didn't do that. And I might add that one of the nice parts of this is that the sports leagues, the NBA, Major League Baseball, the NFL, the NCAA, and the National Hockey League, there were 5 of them that were against us.
We're against you guys.
Were against us.
That was going to be one of my questions. Who was fighting against you with all this?
They were. All the sports leagues and the NCAA claiming that sports betting is going to ruin their games, the integrity, et cetera, et cetera. We'll talk about that.
But you're suing the state, though, to invalidate a statute.
We're suing the federal government to invalidate the federal statute.
Did they oppose it all the way along?
All the way.
Like in different administrations?
All the way they opposed it. And they were able to enjoin us from doing any sports betting. So after we won in the Supreme Court, I made application to collect on the injunction bond, and the sports leagues objected to it. And we took that to the Third Circuit, and we collected a handsome amount of money. So when you talk about did it cost the horsemen money, it did.
Yeah.
But did we get a lot of it back? The answer is yeah.
Did you have a sense that, like, how did the do you remember what the breakdown was of the justices, the U.S. Supreme Court justice, in favor and against? And do you recall much about that? And also, if you could talk about when you're sitting there, were you thinking, "Oh, this is going good for us," or "This is going bad for us," or it was poker face?
It was going great.
Okay. Tell us about that. How do you like?
And
were you surprised by that?
No, because when they decided to take cert, that to me was the tip off that we had at least 4 or 5 of the justices on our side. No, the Justice Breyer and Justice Kagan, who you might think would not support our argument as much as the more conservative justices, Alito, Thomas, Roberts. I think Kennedy was on the court back then. Gorsuch. It was pretty clear from the way the questioning was going that we were going to win, and it was obvious. It wasn't. The thing that amazed me is how we got sidetracked along the way by some not good decisions of the lower courts and by some arguments that the other side was making that were inventive, but invalid, because the case law that we were relying upon, that ultimately the Supreme Court said to the other side, in essence, what are you doing here? You misread our precedents.
Yeah.
So the argument was very good. Nobody walking out of that courtroom thought that we were not going to win.
I remember when I was in law school and especially in con law class, you know, it was easier for me to grapple with areas of the law that were sort of statutory or rule based. That was easier. But when it got to con law, I mean, I had just come off in undergrad, I had come off a clerkship in the U.S. Senate for Bob Dole. So I was very political and I was very kind of partisan. And I would sit in these con law class first year in law school, and I'd be like, "Oh, this is just a bunch of BS. They're just coming up with reasons to get to reach a sort of a political or an end result." You know, and I feel like as I've practiced law, especially in state court and the lower courts, I'd have to say, especially in the trial court, the lower courts, I feel like it's more of a pure exercise where they really are looking at the law and trying to get it right and what's the analysis. But I have to say, in the last several years, I've gotten kind of cynical where, you know, this is just a bunch of creativity that we just create these little mental gymnastics and stuff just to get to the end result, you know. And you just take an example, and as a you know, many years as a con law professor at Seton Hall, you know, you take the right to bear arms. You know, the right to bear arms is as part of a well-regulated militia, et cetera, et cetera. Like, of all the people I know that bear arms not in law enforcement, none of them are in a militia as far as I can tell, you know. But then, you know, but that gets expanded, and the cynical view could be like there's an end result to it, you know, which is to whatever, the NRA and that kind of thing. But then I look at, you know, the right to an abortion. You know, for many years you had a right to an abortion. But it doesn't say anywhere in the Constitution that you have a right to an abortion. It says there's a right to privacy, and then we talk about the penumbras of the Constitution. But the same court or the same justices that will use these sort of mental gymnastics to expand, you know, the right to bear arms will also say that's completely invalid. And now, although it's been legal since the 70s, now we're going to, you know, say there's no longer a constitutional right to abortion. So I guess my question is, when you're doing this, do you sometimes get cynical or frustrated where the law is this or it should be this, but there's just going to be an end result by some judge or justice that wants to reach an end result? And when you're litigating these things, how much are you taking consideration of the broader politics and the players and stuff?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Because there's a lot, you know, the judiciary is supposed to be independent, okay? Especially the U.S. Supreme Court is supposed to be independent. And I know our state justices are not permitted to fly around on jets provided by lawyers that appear before them. But there's some cynicism in the country that the court has become partisan.
There's a lot of cynicism, okay? I'm not one of the cynics. I'm not going to sit here and say that every judge in every case decides the case on the merits by the application of the law to the facts. There's no question that sometimes public opinion, politics, or non-judicially related factors go into a court decision. But I think overwhelmingly, I think most judges do it the right way. And as it relates to the Supreme Court, you have to keep in mind that when it comes to interpreting the Constitution, there are schools of thought on how to do it.
I was going to ask you.
Ranging from originalism to the other end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
So a lot of these decisions that are coming down involving the president, for example, or the Voting Rights Act, the case that just came down the other day, the reason those cases are getting decided the way they're getting decided is because a majority of this court adheres to the same school of thought with respect to how to interpret the Constitution, which is narrower than what had formerly been the case. So, for example, you mentioned the right of privacy, right? The right of privacy does not exist.
It's not set in there.
Not set in the Constitution, but over time, the liberal-leaning members of the court viewed the privacy as emanating from the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment.
Search and seizure.
And then that then creates a whole line of precedent.
Yeah.
Based upon something that liberal-leaning members of the court think the Constitution was meant to provide. Originalists say that's not the case. Okay, so what you see happening is you see the pendulum swinging the other way towards a narrower reading of the Constitution, which is going to produce results that people might think are political results when in fact they're not. And I'll give you an example. A number of years ago, this is a good example, I think. A number of years ago, I represented a high school football coach in East Brunswick. His name was Marcus Borden. And I did this on a pro bono basis because a friend of mine asked me to help out the coach, and little did I know it was going to end up being this case that it ended up being. But what he was doing is he was taking a knee with his players before a football game. And there had been a history of public school players saying prayers before football games. And that offended some of the people in East Brunswick. So they fired the football coach because he wouldn't stop doing what he was doing. So I took on the case and argued that this taking of a knee did not violate the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And we won in the district court.
Because it was content neutral? What was the...
Because he was not endorsing religion, and that no reasonable observer can think that he's praying with the players when all he's really doing is taking a knee, which is in football, you take a knee all the time.
Yeah.
And if the players want to say a prayer and you want to continue to be their coach, you can take the knee with the players without praying with them.
What was the context? Was it like in the locker room, or was it out on the field before kickoff?
It was in the locker room and in the cafeteria.
It's funny. We would pray before every football game. I played football, and the coach would kneel down.
At
We'd
a public
say,
school?
Yeah, you were talking about diversity before, and my first exposure to a diverse academic environment wasn't until law school either. It was, so nobody had anything negative to say about it.
Well, in any event, I won the case in the district court, and the coach was reinstated. It goes to the Third Circuit. We argued it for about 3 hours, and it was one of the few times I brought my wife to court. I said, this is an interesting case. So we went down to Philadelphia together, and the argument went really well for me. And after the argument, my wife said to me, she felt bad for the other side. She said, why don't you go talk to the other lawyer and make him feel better, because they beat him up pretty good. And I said, no, he's a big boy. Well, anyway, I lost the case, right? Lost the case in the Third Circuit.
So the oral argument really well, and we got this in the bag.
Lost
Wow.
Yes, went really well.
Wow.
There was like an 85-page opinion that the Third Circuit came down. I take it to the Supreme Court.
Was it all because of the oral argument you lost it?
I have no
I'm
idea. It could have been.
Kidding.
Maybe I should have kept my mouth shut. I don't know.
Yeah.
But we petitioned for cert to the Supreme Court. They conferenced it twice, and they denied cert. So that was the end of the case. I think it was last term or the year before last term, there was a football coach who was praying with his players, and they upheld his right to pray. Why? Because the composition of the court, when I had my case, and the composition of the court changed. Now, does it mean that it was a predetermined outcome? No.
Yeah.
What it meant was that the new justices, my case was close. I think I had maybe one justice short of winning the case.
Yeah.
When they had a couple of new justices who were appointed by conservative Republican presidents, they looked at the argument, and it was enough to swing the balance, not because of a predetermined outcome, but the school of thought that they applied in interpreting the Constitution.
I think the Supreme Court's a little different. It does sit in a different place than really all the other courts, in the sense that It's a function of elections. Obviously, many courts are a function of elections. They're not directly related to necessarily a democratic process. In Pennsylvania, judges are elected, but so it's a bit related to elections and democracy because they're appointed by people that are, and then so it has to sway a bit. It has to sway a bit with what's going on in the country. If we were I guess the Constitution has to be living and breathing, and it does have to sway a bit with the pendulum of the country going, because if it didn't, we'd still have Jim Crow laws, and we'd still have slavery and things like that. That they evolve as the culture evolves.
But I think the counter argument is that the way you move past that is by amendments to the Constitution. That's the textualist originalist view, which I agree. I think it's almost impossible.
Amendments are hard to get.
So hard to get.
I had a course that I actually created, comparative constitutional law, and we used to compare in the course some of the modern constitutions. Like South Africa, for example, I think their constitution was enacted in the 1990s or 2000s, and so much of what our Supreme Court does through judicial interpretation is right in the Constitution.
Yeah.
But that's not going to happen here. The Constitution's not going to get amended, and we're going to continue to have this approach of judicial review, Marbury versus Madison, and the composition of the courts are going to continue to change, and some of the precedents are going to get overruled, and some are not.
Yeah. I mean, Justice Roberts, I think, publicly has done a lot to try to maintain the integrity of the court, say that we're above politics. But recently, I guess some memos came out from many years ago where I think they were using the emergency docket or something
The shadow docket?
To overturn a lot of Obamacare. Yeah. And there was a memo where he said, we're going to do that and overturn it just to so that that kind of stuff can be concerning in terms of the independence of the judiciary.
Our country right now is as divided as I can remember. Differences of opinion, checks and balances, all of that is totally appropriate. But now it's almost venomous, and that's not good. Disagreeing just for the sake of disagreeing is not good, or empowering any one branch with too much power. That's not good.
So I got to imagine, as a con law professor, you probably didn't give your opinion much on judge or dean, or professor. Did they call in class? They call you dean or professor?
They both.
Both.
I don't know what they called me outside.
No, hey, everyone that's ever said anything about Dean Riccio has always said he's a great guy, and I'm not being patronizing saying that. That's what I've heard. But I have to ask your opinion on the Citizens United case, if you care to give it.
Yeah, well, I mean, to me, that case was all about the payment of money and whether or not it's speech.
Yeah.
Once you go down the road of saying that money is speech.
Yeah.
Well, then it becomes very difficult to put restraints on the speech. So again, this all goes back to how the court reads the free speech clause.
Yeah.
When you think of free speech, you think of words.
Yeah.
But it's not just words.
Yeah.
It's symbolic.
Yeah.
Speech.
Burning flags.
And
actions.
money is a way of expressing a viewpoint. I'm paying my money because I agree with this viewpoint. So I think that you can justify it. Do I like the outcome? Probably not. But the test isn't whether you like the outcome. The test is whether or not it got there, or the court got there in a principled, honest manner.
What was the case that said slavery is legal?
Dred Scott.
So in my humble opinion, not that you asked for it, but I'll give it anyway.
Yeah.
In my humble opinion, I think the Citizens United opinion will go down in history as one of the worst opinions, up there with Dred Scott, because I think it's related to in my opinion, again, I think it's related to a lot of the venom in this country, that opinion. That combined with social media, I think what's happening is the rich are just getting richer, the 1%. Most of the other people are just getting screwed. Money's running the country more so than ever. It's a constant campaign. I think congressmen, congresspersons who are in there 2 years spend at least half their time raising money just to get in there. And that combined with the tribalism that social media causes, I'm in this camp or that camp because of the overload of information. So you can't really dive into issues or think, as we talked about the importance of, you can't really think anymore. There's no time because we're all addicted to our phones. And people getting screwed by that Citizens United opinion and the wealth concentration. That's my view anyway.
Well, I think your view is shared by a lot of people.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's who was the guy that said, I've had it up to here and I'm not going to take it anymore. Remember that?
That's a movie, wasn't it? A movie?
Yeah, it was a movie. I'm done and I'm not going to take it. I'm mad as hell. I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore. I think it's just like the collective country having said, I'm mad as hell and I'm not going to take it anymore, the unfairness.
I had a friend who is he's not tuned in politically. Just this morning sent a text and he's like, man, these gas prices are crazy. It's like, he's just an everyman. And it's like, yeah, that's where we're at right now.
Like we have a thing going on now with, you would think the techies were kind of liberal and stuff. We have this thing going on in the state with Uber. So Uber is trying to pass all kinds of tort reform. It's funny, like if you want to limit it, if you want to limit people's rights to access to the courts and stuff, put caps on attorneys' fees, So what they do is they say, oh, these lawyers are making too much money, so we're going to cap their fees at 20% or 25%. But what that does is just disincentivizes lawyers to take cases on contingency and help people that can't afford to pay lawyers themselves. And so Uber, because they donate, I think they donated like $500,000 to the governor campaign, and then they donated $1 million to the other candidate. And no matter who gets in, they have a seat at the table. Yeah. And Uber is on this crusade around the country to pass tort reform to limit the amount that Uber drivers have to cover in insurance. And I take these red-eye flights from Newark. The Uber drivers you get at like 4 a.m. Whoa. One time I was driving, this guy was driving at about 40 miles an hour on the Garden State Parkway. He couldn't see. He was literally driving 40 miles an hour. I'm like, do you know what's going on? So Ubers in the country is going all around to limit their liability for that kind of thing, and when they crash, and also limit the amount of insurance they have to have. So it's just more money in politics, and they have like unlimited money to pass this stuff. That's not good for everyone else.
Well, one of the points you just touched on, Jerry, is the incentivization of lawyers to take cases.
Yeah.
Which takes me, Mark, I know you wanted to talk about the schoolyard murder cases.
Yeah. Do you want to do a little, we'll break it down, little framework, and then we'll get there? You tell me if you're cool.
You tell me, but can we take a break first?
Sure.
Yeah.
We'll do it, because I'd like to talk
break.
about the 16 years you worked before becoming dean, and then all the work you did after, which includes that MS-13.
Okay, sure.
Awesome.
Yeah.